I am Alessandra Venturini, the holder of the Jean Monnet Chair in European Migration Studies, funded by the European Commission. I'm very glad today to continue the second edition of the seminar Cocumint, Consumption of Cultural Goods as Driver of Migrant Integration. The seminar is interdisciplinary with contribution by economists, anthropologists, social scientists, linguistics, demographers, and also by an artist. And we were very honored that an artist which is expert in social inclusion. And we were very happy that we have yesterday, last year Michelangelo Pistoletto, and yesterday Marinella Senatore that intervened in the presentation. Now we are always very happy that Berndt Clavier, who is Berndt Clavier is not a linguistic, I would say, no, as a training probably. You can specify better, that accepted to participate to this lecture. Berndt is a senior lecturer at School of Art, Communication in Malmö in Sweden. He is also member of the David Court section of IMISCOE, which is the largest international migration research network in Europe. And she has published a lot, and she has, I would say, she's published a lot on aesthetic and art management. Today, the title of his presentation is really fascinating. It is, Why is Migration at the Center of Cultural Policy? I give him the floor, and we are all listening to you. Thank you very much, Berndt.
Thank you, Alessandra. Thank you for those kind words. So I have a background in philosophy and literature, somewhat different from many of the other people who are in the difficult section of IMISCO. And I think that this will be reflected in the presentation that I'm about to give. So I think that maybe my presentation is a bit different from presentations that you probably hear in the context of the master's degree that you are studying. So I hope that you will bear with me, and I'm really happy to answer any questions you have at the end. And don't be afraid to ask them. Don't be afraid to ask any, what you consider perhaps to be naive questions, or if something irritates you in what I said, just feel free to ask. So I have a PowerPoint presentation that I will start in a moment, and my presentation today consists of parts where I will be reading a manuscript to you, and I do this because I have this tendency to drift off into I begin to tell a different story than the one that I was supposed to do. So in order for me not to do that, I sort of discipline myself to a text in some sections. So you will notice that I will be beginning this presentation by reading a bit to you, and then eventually when I feel that I've read enough, I can sort of just simply show you the presentation rather than that. But I do feel the need to situate my question so that you might understand what it is that I want to say and what it is that I want to tell you. So I should perhaps start by explaining this question: why is the immigrant at the center of European cultural policy? And perhaps even I should rephrase it: is the immigrant at the center of European cultural policy? Can we really say that? How would we measure such a centrality? And what does that mean? What does it mean that the immigrant is at the center of European cultural policy? What does it mean for cultural policy? But perhaps even more importantly, what does it mean for art? But before I begin to answer this question and these sets of questions and move into my main argument, let me start by pronouncing a caveat. I'm not an economist. I'm not a sociologist nor a political scientist. And I feel the need to say this in the present company, mostly out of respect of the disciplines that you represent. Unlike some of you, I will not be able to quantify my claims, right? I will not have recourse to the objectivity of numbers to prove that migrants are central to cultural policy. Instead, my argument will be cast in the language of political philosophy and be based on readings of political and technical documents, but also on the history of cultural policy in Europe, its trajectory in the 20th century. And that trajectory, in turn, is part of a larger transformation of politics, a transformation which is an integral part of my argument. I therefore need to address my topic through three interrelated problematics. And here I'm going to start the presentation. So firstly, put it like this. I think we need to historicize cultural policy. We need to understand that cultural policy is not like other policy areas. Not only is cultural policy the newest branch on the tree of policy in Europe, it also constitutes the clearest evidence of that massive transformation of politics that I was hinting at a moment ago. A transformation which occurred in the 20th century and that we are having problems understanding even today, not least because many of the concepts available to us stem from or originate from the 18th and 19th century and remain with us as dead husks and empty shells. By historicizing cultural policy, we will not only be able to discern its special character, but we will also see how the political rationalities and the political technologies that constitute cultural policy have transformed us and has transformed politics. So we need to historicize. And this section I call the governmentalization of art. Secondly, we need to be able to analyze the trajectory of cultural policy from its establishment until now. Cultural policy is a new type of policy, one that originated in the 1950s and is connected to the global efforts made by after World War II to transform the historical conditions for politics on the planet. Here, the formation and development of UNESCO and other UN agencies are important events, as is the global process of decolonization, exemplified, for instance, in the Bandung Conference of 1955. By closely examining the political rationalities underpinning and propelling the evolution of cultural policy, and thus see the political technologies that are developed as part of this evolution, we will be able to see how the migrant emerges as the necessary object for cultural policy, a field, a ground, and a body on which what I call the governmentalization of art and culture may take place. And that section I call the historical ontology of cultural policy. And then thirdly and finally, we need to challenge ourselves to see what cultural policy does to art and our sense of aesthetics, and what the endless series of cultural and artistic projects on behalf of the migrants are doing to the migrants. This is perhaps the most provocative part of my argument, that well-intended artistic projects sometimes end up contributing to the racialization of migrants, that they unintentionally brighten boundaries and sometimes even create them, solidify them, maintain them. This last problematic is connected to the first and the second. So all three of them have to be seen in relation to one another. So let me move in to the first of these sections, the governmentalization of art. More than ever before, we live in an epoch of the population. However, it is difficult for us to see this. Our papers are in order, and the state seldom calls upon us to prove ourselves. We are surrounded by a political and legal infrastructure that we have come to take for granted. Yes, this is all now subject to digitization and the echo chambers of social media, but the basic facts remain. We are citizens. We have rights. Those rights are often connected to our bodies by a legal and procedural framework that recognizes us as individuals. Based on our identities, we can make claims on the state, and our duties and responsibilities over and against the state are personal ones. This individual relationship to the state is an essential one. Looking at the history of state formation and the evolving concept of freedom, Quentin Skinner suggests that the medieval idea that we owe our freedom and property to the monarch was once profoundly felt and agreed upon. Skinner quotes John Cowell's gloss on the term libertas in his law dictionary of 1607, and I quote, "The term libertas refers to a privilege held by grant or prescription, whereby men enjoy some benefit or favor beyond ordinary subjects." Skinner's account is a magnificent political history of ideas, which takes us from Cowell's medieval conceptualization of liberty over Neo-Roman definitions of the civis, the free subject, to the 20th century orthodoxy that liberty must be understood as absence of constraint. And yet Skinner ends on a note of warning concerning the present state of diminishing freedoms, one that centers on, I quote, asymmetric relations of power and powerlessness, which include the triumph of free markets, leaving successive governments subject to blackmail by multinational corporations, and the workforce increasingly dependent on the arbitrary power of employers, unquote. And baked into this asymmetry, Skinner suggests, is an illiberal sense of rights based on ethnic belonging, a kind of structural racism which causes continuing pressure to be placed on ethnic minorities to conform to a normative account of what it means to belong to the nation. What Skinner is formulating here is a phase in our political history that many commentators have tried to describe in terms of neoliberalism. In Undoing the Demos, Wendy Brown argues that neoliberalism is not only a remaking of the state, it is also a remaking of the soul. It is this remaking of the soul, it is in this remaking of the soul that we encounter the asymmetries described by Skinner. Neoliberalism is not only converting a distinctly political character, meaning an operation of democracy's constituents, elements, into economic ones, it is also a source of a new type of population-based racism. So how does cultural policy enter into this narrative of asymmetric power relations and the neoliberal remaking of the soul? What is the connection between neoliberal forms of racism and cultural policy? By speaking the words racism and cultural policy simultaneously, I want to point out that racism has transformed from the protocols of hygiene, biology, and concentration camps to a concern for the security of the population modulated by discourses of social cohesion and social sustainability. We need to pinch ourselves in the arm and remember Hannah Arendt's caution that racism and bureaucracy developed in tandem. In her magnificent The Origins of Totalitarianism, she shows that racism is a political technology, a ruling device, as she puts it, and not a feeling or an ideology or a false consciousness. Racism is not the same thing as bureaucracy, but they are, Arendt tells us, the two main political devices of imperialist rule. The Origins of Totalitarianism is the story of the transformation of the state from an instrument of the law into an instrument of the nation. It is a history of how and why the nation had conquered the state and national interests were given priority over law. Ever since this happened, the alien, the immigrant, the stateless person has become the physical reminder of a non-belonging to the nation. Arendt's conclusion is not dissimilar from Skinner's or Brown's. Once the state abandons a rule through constitutional rights and laws set to protect our individual liberties, we become subject to the temporary and changing decrees of a bureaucratic logic that threatens our individual freedom. What I call the governmentalization of art tells the story of how art and culture became subject to this bureaucratic problematization. And as I said before, the fact that art has been governmentalized is a sort of litmus test for the claims made by Skinner, Brown, and Arendt. I say this because a policy to regulate art is to a greater degree than, say, health policy or social policy or labor market policy, a policy that regulates freedom. Why?
May I
Explain.
ask a question,
Yeah,
Berta? Sorry, may I ask a question?
sure.
So, okay, as you know, I am null in this field. I am newcomer and so on. But I was very surprised reading there's like cultural policy transforming our values. Of course, but also our values change cultural policy. In the past, before the new liberalism, we had the kingdom, and the kingdom were even more forcing the cultural policy. The building were all religious or of the kingdom. So I think the new liberalism was a step ahead. Or
Yeah, I'm not. I'm gonna address that issue very shortly.
okay.
So if you just wait a second, so I'll come to
No,
that.
I wait.
It's the next session of my argument. But what I want to ask now is why is it that cultural policy, more than any other policy, is a policy that regulates freedom? And the answer is very easy to see. If you can you guys see me and the presentation at the same time? Or can you only see the presentation? Am I just a disembodied voice?
We
No, you can
also
see me.
see you in a corner.
Okay, cool. Yeah, okay. So why is it that cultural policy regulates freedom when, say, health policy doesn't or social policy doesn't? And here I think we can sort of make that manifest by a very simple intellectual operation. If you read the law, if you read Italian law, if you read any national law in a democratic society, it becomes immediately evident that art has a special position in the law. It is granted much greater freedoms from infringement than, say, any other public discourse. If I make a speech and I say certain things that are obscene, there are obscenity laws that I can be punished with. I can be I can be sued for libel and so on and so forth. But if you're an artist and you produce a work of art, a much greater freedom is granted to you, a greater freedom of expression. And this freedom of expression that we see in the law is correlated.
Scusi, ma non ho bisogno.
Sorry.
Don't
What's
worry.
the question?
Don't worry. Go ahead.
So, so the law makes art freer than any other discourse in society. If I, as a journalist, write something, I'm subject to libel suits. But if I make an artwork, I have much more leeway. And philosophically, this can be explained. The law is sort of it comes together with philosophy on this. Art is perceived as a special kind of discourse in philosophy. In fact, what sort of constitutes artistic discourse, philosophically speaking, is that it does not, it doesn't speak clearly, right? Art is speaking to our sentiments, not to our sense. So philosophically speaking, loads of philosophers have defined the special character of art. And ever since Immanuel Kant, ever since the Enlightenment, in Western philosophy, this has been linked to the concept of freedom. So for Kant, everything else that we do with our brains, all the concepts that we generate, all the morality that we imagine, all those things are predetermined by some sort of conceptual order. There's already something existing with which I work. The only space, according to Kant, where the human being is truly free is in art, because art cannot be translated into propositions. Art cannot be calculated. So art is a very special form of discourse, both legally and philosophically. And it's, of course, this capacity of art which at first has attracted policymakers. Cultural policy begins with the focus of trying to improve the conditions of individuals to be affected by art. In the policies about art, which I've been looking at before the invention of cultural policy, I mean policies of art before the 1950s, lawmakers often articulate this organic side of aesthetics. In one government report on the arts in Sweden, art education in Sweden from 1956, art is made into an essential component of the individual's capacity to develop morally, ethically, but also psychologically. There are two broad perspectives on the history of cultural policy in academia today that address this issue. One, which we perhaps a bit speciously can call the British variant, argues for a definition of cultural policy which incorporates all attempts by the state to shape attitudes, values, and behaviors. The second definition of cultural policy might be called the French variant, because this particular argument about cultural policy originated with a group of French researchers, sociologists, and has found its most distinctive description in publications such as Cultural Policy, the Genesis of a Category of Public Intervention, or The Invention of Cultural Policy. These are all texts from the 90s. According to the French definition, cultural policy is a latecomer in the catalogue of governmental programming and intimately tied up with what one of these French sociologists, Dubois, calls democratization of culture. Accordingly, Dubois asserts, cultural policy cannot be summed up by the origins of the different forms of support from public authorities to the arts, but rather is a specific integration and arrangement of these multiple interventions. So, whatever we had in terms of art support prior to the 50s, prior to the moment that I call neoliberalization, the moment when government becomes technologized properly in Europe. That's not cultural policy, according to these French sociologists, because cultural policy becomes a policy only when all these different things that existed previously have been coherently organized under the aegis of a departmental logic. So as soon as a country develops a department of art and culture and produces the whole spectrum of political technologies that departmental politics has as its weapons or as its tools, only then, according to this type of sociology, can we talk about cultural policy. So the historical ontology of cultural policy is a recent one. Cultural policy, according to this French sociology, and I think according to myself too, is invented in the 50s. And it's possible to trace the invention quite exactly, because what happens when government produces things like this, when states do it, and especially when superstatal agencies are involved, is that loads of paper traces are left. So it's quite possible to go back into the formation of these laws, the formation of these policies, the formation of these steering instruments, as UNESCO calls them, and trace how they were produced, how they were made. And what that means is that we are moving, and here's the bit that you asked about, Alessandra, about the king. We're moving from an 18th century understanding of art that creates the grounds for a sensus communis. And that 18th century understanding of art is roughly, similar to the idea of monumental and extravagant public investments. We have, I mean, if you go to any square in any city in Europe, you will see the effects of this understanding of art, right? It's monumental, it's spectatorial. What has happened since the 50s is that this spectatorial, monumental idea of art has been transformed into what another French thinker, Ruffel, calls micro-political approaches. Approaches that privilege the inscription of the artist into a given social fabric. Now, this has had a couple of consequences. Vincent Dubois talks about that from the 1960s. State agents have gained a new influence in the production of culture. And in France in particular, this is actually it's a shocking transformation, because in the French cultural scene, the state was regarded from the perspective of art as an enemy. In France, artists very often defined themselves against the state. So in the 1920s, it was almost impossible for the French state, for the French government, to be able to contract artists into doing things for them. Pierre Bourdieu has written a very detailed sociology of this in his book Distinctions. But from the 1960s in France, state agents gained a new influence here. This tradition, this anti-statal tradition in France was broken. Recognition, of greatness in art became intrinsically linked to the state's level of support. Artistic certification and public aid could no longer be dissociated. So, whereas the anti-statal sentiment amongst the artists wasn't as great in Sweden, we can see a similar development. And I think, that we can see a similar development more or less across the democratic world, because what led this development, this transformation of the state's role in the cultural sector, on the artistic field, was a project launched by UNESCO in the 60s that really took off in the 70s. UNESCO produced something that they called a clearinghouse, where nation after nation in the world was to deliver a report to UNESCO on the state of cultural policy in their country. And the delivery of this report was quite detailed. The response in Sweden was to erect a government agency to be able to cater for this report. So a government agency was founded in order to meet the requirements that UNESCO had laid down. And similar things happened in other countries in the world. So after the 70s, we get a tremendous, how shall I call it, a tremendous, cultural policies in the different countries become very similar, right? This supranational national level of UNESCO is able to produce a coherence that is quite remarkable when we look at the cultural policies of country by country. So there were at least three consequences that are really important in this development. Artistic practices are, from this moment on, increasingly attached to a cultural program, which means that there are political rationalities projecting outcomes for artistic practices. Art is now also understood as a vector of social cohesion, and art is institutionalized into new centers of transmission, such as educational, commercial, and social welfare institutions. So we can kind of see this historically, how this transformation of how art is governed creates a new spaces for art to exist. And these spaces, the fact that art moves into educational, commercial, and social welfare institutions also correspond, at least in Sweden. I actually only have Sweden as an example here, but in Sweden it corresponds to a withdrawal of the state from those institutions. So at the same time as government expenditure actually dramatically decreases in these areas, art is pushed in. So a typical example is that social workers are taken out of marginalized places in Sweden, and at the same time funds are made available for artists to operate in the spaces cleared by the social workers. So we can begin to see that in order to talk about cultural policy, we cannot really talk about what happened in the 19th century or the 18th century or in any other century before that, because the systematicity that is attached to cultural policy today is simply not there in those preceding centuries. Today, cultural policy is a systematic collection of actions and measures taken under ministerial authority and under the aegis of a specialized administration associated with local and regional authority action. So cultural policy is part of this reorganization of the powers of the state, which now are regulated at a distance by the powerful mechanisms of audits, standards, benchmarks, and budgets. So this is all very tightly knit together. And we can now make a kind of a historical chart of the different phases of cultural policy in the European welfare state. We can see that there's an initial moment, and that there was a moment right after that initial moment, and another moment, and a fourth moment. And I can very boldly state that these phases happen all over Europe. They happen at different times. I think that the model most perfectly fits Britain and France, but also Germany, I believe Italy, certainly Sweden, all the Scandinavian countries, can be seen inside this model, right? So we have the emergence of cultural policy in the 1950s. As the creation of a systematic cultural supply policy based on two principles, excellence and democratization, and a limited definition of culture suitable for public financing. So you have the ministries of culture, they define art in such a way that they can afford to finance it. And that means that it's very much organized around the idea of excellence. So you fund excellent art. And what's democratic about this funding is that you try to make excellent art available in spaces, in places where it's not normally available, right? So you want to make people come to the opera, you want to make people come to theaters, you want to make people come and see high class, high art. So it's also a very aristocratic idea of art that is underpinning the initial model. But then very quickly, and especially in France, there was this debate about the idea of excellence here. Linked to, in aesthetic terms, linked to a sort of a modernist transgression of those ideals. Jacques Lang, there's a number of ministers of culture that are associated with this criticism of the idea of excellence. And so now a gradual decentralization occurred of public action, which leads to an increasing disparity in the aims and functions of cultural policy, which challenges the initial universalist and unanimist model. So very quickly, cultural policy began to challenge itself, to challenge, what is good art? Should we only fund good art? Isn't this just bourgeois art that we make available for the working classes? Shouldn't we fund working class art? What about regional art? And you can see this debate in quite a lot of countries. In Sweden, it becomes somewhat different from the debate in France or in Britain, because in Sweden it focuses on handicraft. So the handicraft movement, which was very strong in Sweden, seized this notion of decentralization and made a space for itself to be funded through cultural policy. But then we have the neoliberal revision that often gets talked about, and in terms of cultural policy, it happens in the 80s. But I would like to suggest that what I call neoliberalism, what I call, and I work with the concept through a philosopher called Michel Foucault. The initial model is already neoliberal in that it's trying to define goals, and it's trying to audit those goals. It's trying to run art as if you run a company, in the sense that you have a goal, and then you make sure you look if you give it a budget, and then you see what the results are. So this measuring of the results, this sort of economic dimension, is actually already there in the 50s. But in the 1980s, it becomes fundamentally pronounced. Now a revision of the legitimate scope of public action is underway, and this opens the borders for cultural policy to entertainment culture. And in Sweden, this becomes rather funny, because in the two previous models in Sweden, popular culture was seen as something bad. You can see in the legal documents that the state says that it wants to support excellent art in order to counterweigh the bad influence of American popular culture. The United States is even named in those legal documents these Swedish legal documents as a problem. The American popular culture is a problem for the development of aesthetic taste in Sweden. Now in the 1980s, that is totally dropped. And all of a sudden, entertainment culture also becomes something that cultural policy wants to regulate. And this is when we fall into the 90s, and we have not fallen out of the 90s yet. This is where we are now. Cultural policy is a type of industrial policy, but it's also a policy of social cohesion. So economic growth and the balance of national social diversity begin to legitimize the regulatory power of public action, encouraging the expansion of the creative industries and the demands for the evaluation of procedures and results which may prove the social benefits of the arts. And this, if you log on to the European Commission, if you log on to the web pages of the Commission on culture and art, you will see this all over the place, all over the place. A call for better data. We need to know the effects of arts. We need to be able to measure it in terms of its monetary value, so that we know if we should invest in a library or in a gym, in a tennis court or in an art gallery. And this leaves me with my third section, cultural policy and neoliberal racism. So I said before that I think we have to understand. Sorry, you're sharing. Okay. So I said before that Hannah Arendt, in her Origins of Totalitarianism, shows how bureaucracy was invented as a means of controlling overseas territories. Bureaucracy was invented as an imperialist technique. And she also says that race was also invented as an imperialist technique, and that they both developed in tandem. We can see how bureaucracy and racism co-produce the colonial territory. And the origins of totalitarianism really lie in when that colonial logic comes back to Europe and produces two world wars. So what we have here is an example from my hometown, Malmö Museum, Modern Museum in Malmö, which has an exhibition of street art, and you can see power here written on the stage. And this is the absolute highest art institution in Sweden. It's the Museum of Modern Art in Stockholm, and it has a branch in Malmö. And they are now interested in, art as a questioning of power, right? And in this exhibition, then they're literally forgetting this part of the equation that Perry Grayson is trying to point at here, right? This artwork will generate the local economy. That's this urn from 2007, comfort blanket, the one up on top from 2014, but already in 2004, lovely consensus. Here's an artist that is explicitly addressing this problematic relationship between the state and art, which in the Modern Museum exhibition on street art is totally forgotten, right? What the Modern Museum wants to show are things like this, how street art is liberating young people, making them able to express themselves, how it allows immigrants to have a voice, etc., and so on and so forth. And all this is, of course, true. But another side is also true of this equation. And here is where the neoliberal sort of focus on racism. So this neoliberal reason is located with a new form of racism. And this is inside the same body of projects. And this is from an immigrant-dense neighborhood, and it's a particular project that I followed for 2 years. And this is the climax of the project. Now, you have to understand that the state, the Swedish state, invested millions into this. It's a huge program. It's modeled on a British program called Creative Places and Peoples. So millions of money was connected to it. And in order to, for an artist, in order to be legible for the funding, you had to practice your art in certain housing areas. That was the formulation. And the cultural ministry used a metric called the SOM metric, which is basically a neighborhood metric that the Swedish government has developed to see level, how many people are voting in elections in this neighborhood, what is the income, what is the how much crime is there, how many people have been sentenced to jail, or have had problems with the law, what is the level of education. So basically it becomes a benchmark of neighborhoods, and in order to be able to acquire funding from this project, you had to work your art in a neighborhood like that, right? So I followed this project. It started very optimistically, printing thousands of leaflets and sending it to all the post letter boxes in all the flats in this area, asking people to come to participate in producing a theater show that would enact the migration crisis in Iraq, the escape to safety over the Mediterranean. Nobody came. So a new set of documents was erected, this time translated into even more languages. And again, people were summoned to contribute to this theater project, and nobody came. And the artists just couldn't get the population to participate. Nobody was interested. And eventually, the millions had to be spent in some way. And so it became a hip hop concert here on the Green. And of course, this project was heavily monitored by the state. It had to report back. It had to report back to the government. What had it done for the money? How did you spend the money? And in that reporting back, I mean, the artists became co-opted in this sort of racist logic. Statements had to be made that the people who live here are so excluded from society, so marginalized, that they don't contribute, they don't participate. So a kind of knowledge was established because of this art project, a knowledge that in fact marginalized the people who live here even further. So this is the danger, I think. We often think of art. What harm can art do? And of course, art itself can't do any harm. A theater, a concert or a theater show doesn't harm anyone. But when the state manages art, certain inscriptions can be made. These people have been marginalized further, not by the concert that was made here, but by the reports that have gone back to the state. The failure of this project is reported back into other statistics about the marginalization of these people. And what this amounts to is what I've come to call a borderscaping of the racial archipelago. And I take this idea of cultural policy and art projects as participating in some sort of borderscaping from two anthropologists, Sandro Mesadra and Brett Nielsen, who have written a book called Border as Method, or the Multiplication of Labor. And I want to end by suggesting that the quote that I'm going to read to you now, in a very strong way, summarizes what this art project did, right? The strange form of excision by which states establish such zones and enclaves by removing them from ordinary normative arrangements allows a plurality of legal orders, labor regimes, patterns of economic developments, and even cultural styles to emerge. We argue that these zones, which have proliferated in number and type, invert the logic of exception that in recent time many thinkers have used to explain the new forms of securitization epitomized by the camp. Rather than being spaces of legal voidness, they are saturated by competing norms and calculations that overlap and sometimes conflict in unpredictable but also negotiable ways. The forms of accumulation they enable spur processes of spatial and social reorganization that extend well beyond their borders, making these sites paradigmatic for any serious political examination of the current global predicament. So what cultural policy does now is that it targets the migrant in order to produce for the migrant some sort of road into normative society. But in the targeting of migrant, it also produces enclaves, right? It treats migrants different from the national population, and in that difference, it produces these zones and enclaves. And the danger is that when artists contribute or collaborate on these projects, they proliferate these zones. They become co-opted by this new form of neoliberal racism. And therefore, I think that before we engage as artists, or before we sort of jump on the bandwagon of programs to help migrants do this or that, we need to understand, or we need to situate that in a proper context. I believe that this project seriously failed to do what it intended to do originally, but it seriously succeeded in doing what Sandra and Brett Nielsen call borderscaping. So, thank you for listening to me.
Berndt, thank you very much for this comprehensive discussion and presentation of the role of cultural policy, the combination. I know that Roberta would like to ask a questions. I think also Pina Cortese. Roberta, go ahead.
Yes. Okay. First of all, thank you for this new and interesting perspective. So I have two questions for you. The first one is when the part of cultural integration of immigrant in the country of destination implies multiple cultural identity, so native and from their country of origin. How do you think, how should cultural policy move through art? How should it manage these multiple identities to generate, as you say, a cohesion vector? So, because I think that it's very complicated to manage a multiple ethnic identity of immigrant. So the second one is more specific. So do you think that the specific physical location of the places of cultural fruition, for instance, House of Dreams in Malmo, or I don't know, Arena 305 can affect the final result. So, because if I remember correctly, these two places are located in a very segregated area, no? So, do you think that the physical specific location of these places can affect the final result? So the objective that the cultural policies are set itself. I ask you this question because very often physical and cultural distance represents a very important variable in the problem of cultural integration. Thank you.
Yeah, so the first question is kind of complicated, I think. I think it's problematic that the state wants to manage art. I think that's problematic. I do realize, of course, that I mean, the reason we have cultural policy in the first place at all is because a lot of theaters died. They ceased to exist between 1880 and the First World War. It's called the dearth of theaters. And that has to do with the transformation of consumption patterns in the middle class. All of a sudden, consumer culture emerged and people wanted to buy stuff instead of, paying for the local theater and so on and so forth. So something happened in Europe that led to the death of theaters, and the state at that time had to step in to finance theaters so that cities would still have theaters. And I've read those documents. I've read the documents for several cities where they discuss how they will alleviate this dearth of theaters. And they say in those documents at that time that the state cannot finance art because art is a private matter. Art is not a cultural good, or sorry, art is not a public good. So the state cannot dabble in arts. So all these places in Europe that try to promote art, try to maintain theaters, had to sort of sneak around this proposition. So all over Europe, governments in various ways managed to finance theaters outside of the budget, outside of the ordinary budget of things, right? But when after the 50s, when we get something called cultural policy proper and cultural policy is budgeted, then the state has its logic, right? When the state pays for the railroads or when the state pays for hospitals, it needs to know what it's getting, right? And this is the problem with funding art today, is that art has to report back. It's subject to audits, right? So one way that artists have capitalized on this is to say, well, art is this beautiful vehicle of integration. We can integrate immigrants through art. And so artists can get funding for the job of integrating immigrants. But if you look closely at the problematics, art will always fail at integrating immigrants. The integration of immigrants is not as a mindset. Integration is a much more it's a much more holistic thing. Integration, you're integrated into a society when you have a future in that society, when you have a stake in that society's future. Integration in a society means that you have a job, you have the prospect of a future together with the people of that society. What we call integration, when we talk in terms of immigration now, is kind of a containment policy. Can we integrate these immigrants into not breaking the law? Can we integrate these immigrants into perhaps taking a job rather than going on social welfare? The integration efforts are still sort of operating on the logic of us and them. And I think that, for any artists to seriously take up that is problematic. So I don't think that I think that we have a problem here. I think that artists need to protest against this logic of integration that is so current at the moment. And I think that we need to problematize the whole situation, not just of what art projects are doing in terms of migrant integration, but also, what is integration? We need to problematize what we mean when we say that people who are not from here need to be integrated into the ways of thinking that are present here. That's a political problematic that needs to be opened up. It needs to be unpacked. It needs to be problematized. And then your second question is, yes, I mean, I've studied the House of Dreams and Arena 305, and again, both of those places have huge problems in my view. The problem is this: these are spaces of art in places of exclusion, in places of multiple vulnerabilities, but they're also owned by by the majority population. It's like they're trying to make effects on minorities, but it is almost like it's almost like a colonial trading post or whatever, you know, like it's like a white space in a sea of color. So here you have the House of Dreams, and immigrants may come to the House of Dreams to have their dreams modified, right? House of Dreams goes out to do work on children in school who have no who don't have the right to not to participate. They are forced into participation with what these artists are doing. So there is this asymmetry of power already inscribed into the House of Dreams and into Arena 305. Next to Arena 305, there is something much more modest, a place which is simply called a meeting place, where nothing happens. I think that this is really interesting. So you have Arena 305, which is very controlled by the state. It contains lots of expensive equipment, as does House of Dreams. It has a very big budget. It has a large undertaking, and it reports back, and it's part of this discourse, right? But right next to Arena 305 is this very humble place, which is basically just an open door with coffee and pancakes. It's a library, so it's got like loads of books. It's a place where people can meet and talk and watch television, play computer games, play cards. There's somebody there to help school children with their homework. That place is full of people. The immigrants go to that place because it does not have an agenda. It does not have a program. It's a place that feels safe because you don't have to participate in something somebody else has made up, some sort of scheme made up somewhere else by someone else that is designed to make you think differently about things. This place is simply a place where you can appear as yourself. And that is always chock full. Whereas these other places are really struggling with getting people to participate. And I think that this is a very good example, really, of what I'm after. I don't think that a lot of migrants feel happy about participating in these artistic projects because they know that they are being that the difference between them and others are being highlighted in those projects. And it's the highlighting of that difference which is problematic. One of the first artistic projects that I followed ever was one in House of Dreams, where a lot of photojournalists took immigrant children out into the Swedish forest and basically played games with them there. And the idea was that the forest is a really important place in the consciousness of Swedes. Swedes love nature, right? It's part of their national consciousness. So the idea was, let's let these immigrant kids meet the forest and have an experience of the forest. And we take some photographs because we're photographs, right? And so I followed on the bus, and there's this kid that I start talking to. What is he? Maybe 10 years old. And he looks at me and he says, "Aren't you afraid that we're going to beat you up when we come to the once we come to the forest?" "No, why should I be afraid?" "Well, we're immigrants. We do that kind of thing. We beat white people up." And I was thinking, this guy, he sits on this bus. He's 10 years old. He knows the reason he sits on that bus. The reason is he's an immigrant. And that to me is not what art is. Art, if we want to keep this 18th century, 19th century definition of art, which I think is really good, that art is not a propositional thing, art is not conceptual, art works through sentiments, but it's not calculable, then we shouldn't be doing that thing to a 10-year-old. We should not bring this 10-year-old out on an expedition where his difference is highlighted, where his otherness is the object of the photographic experience.
Thank you.
Can I ask you a question, Bert? Before the student have become brave enough to ask to ask you their doubt. Okay, as you know, I'm an economist. I'm used to measure.
Yeah.
When you speak, I have the problem because I have the value, I have the cultural policy, and I have the social policy. So I think that the value shape the cultural policy, and the cultural policy, of course, has feedback on the value of a state. But you can consider cultural consumption as a way of approaching the social policy. One of the many projects to integrate people are cultural. Integrate women, young, disabled, our culture. So it's not something that exists only for the foreigner. It exists also for any group which needs support. For the migrant, is more important because they have to bridge from their own culture to the culture of the country destination. So the cultural policies are used to favor integration of migrants because they're not, you don't bring young people only to the swimming pool to make them, or play football to make them socializing. The cultural policy, you bring them to museum or you try to make with them a cultural activity, painting and so on, because this make them closer to the cultural destination country, or you make you more familiar to their own artistic culture. So, but after that, I think reporting back to the state or make an evaluation of the policy is something correct. So I don't think that the fact that if you consider an artistic activity, a policy which is done to favor the inclusion of people who are foreigner, disabled, women, and so on, of a group. Of course, if they're not mainstreaming, I would say, if you don't think they are a group that needs special attention, you do not have policy for them. And cultural policy is a policy which has something more. Is not only trying to empower them. Yesterday you were not with us, but Marinella Senatore was exactly showing that her artistic work was able to empower a lot of people. In her work, they were young, old, black, white, yellow, Indian, well-dressed, badly dressed, everybody was able to create empowerment. And so art is able to do this more than, because if you have sports, for instance, some of the other, they are unable to participate in the sport. So I don't think that is negative that you report back to the state that an activity is done for inclusion. And the guy that the boy who is in the bus, this activity exists because they are migrant.
No.
You see, it's a way of seeing this, but you don't, but in this way you hide the positive effect of artistic activity to empower and to include people that need inclusion.
Okay, let me answer the question philosophically, right? Kant, ever since Kant, in philosophy, art has been understood as a space, a very abstract space for the development of our sensibilities. Our sensibilities develop. So we can, we're not just talking about immigrants, we can talk about ourselves. You know, when I started to listen seriously to opera, I had to learn, right? It was a learning process. And only so far as I could, I learned about opera, could my feelings correspondingly develop too. So now I have a sense of opera in which my feelings for the music that I'm hearing somehow correspond to what I know that I'm listening to. And when I'm talking about my feelings about opera to somebody else who also knows about opera, we share that feeling. I can say a similar thing for certain art forms. I know a lot about certain forms of art, and and looking at them, watching them, seeing them, produces a certain sentiment in me. And when I talk to people who also know this art, I recognize that sentiment. This is what Immanuel Kant means by sensus communis, that we develop a sense together. We form a kind of community of sensibility through art. And that is what, most philosophers say, that is the fantastic role of art in our society, to produce this community sense. Now, the what that requires is some sort of learning. It's not automatic. The way that art works is usually through some sort of Kant uses the word Geselligkeit, which is basically just like a being together, but it's based on some sort of competence, right? So a competence-based being together is what art does. So for me to enjoy poetry, for instance, I need to know something about poetry. I have to start somewhere. I don't need to know a lot, but I need at least to be willing to learn. So art requires attention. Art requires an individual form of engagement. So just reading poetry to people who are not interested in poetry actually has no effect, right? Art does not operate like that, So let's say I have a project where I simply read poetry to people on the bus. Anybody who's on the bus, I read poetry to them. And then I say, this is going to have great effects on their lives. That's not true, right? The public reading of poetry only has effects if you want to hear it. If there's a sort of a will to engage with that art, right? And connected to that will is the development of some sort of competence. So in the 19th century, the idea to make art expand its reach has to go through education. So for anybody in the 19th century to think about this, they would say yeah, we have to build art into the schools, into the school systems. We have to learn children to appreciate art, to see, what art can do, to give them a chance to appreciate it. What we have today is, I think, philosophically not defensible. I mean, I'm not sure. I'm not criticizing the artist that you had last week. She says everybody is empowered by her art. I just don't think it operates in that simple way. Yes, you can be empowered if you learn something. And it's there's even a German name for this. It's called Bildung, right? And Bildung doesn't mean that you have to be very educated. It's just that you learn to discern, you
Yes.
learn to judge,
Yes.
right? Yeah.
Also,
that is empowering, of course, right? But I'm not sure that the way in which this delivery model that we have built for migration, that places the migrant at the center of cultural policy today, involves any learning. The kid on the bus that I referred to, what did he learn? Well, he learned that he was different. He learned about his own otherness. That was what he learned. He did not learn about photography. He did not understand photography more based on that trip. And this is where I think we need to be realistic. Art has a good name. A good name. If you say that you're doing some artistic project, people will respect you simply because of that. But we also have to begin to think, what does my art project do? not just in terms of, if I say that I'm empowering other people, what did it do? Did it produce statistics that actually put these people in a worse place? Did it contribute to the sort of border regime that we see established everywhere? My example of the bus, yes, right? This example that I showed a photograph of, which ended up in a hip hop concert, that certainly did that too. It proved to the Swedish state that Muslim migrants, Arabic immigrants, do not participate. It gave further proof of this non-participatory way of being. And in that sense, it did not empower those people, right? So I think that we need to start reevaluating what it is that we think that our art projects are doing. Because we can ride a very long way on the good name that art has, because art has, talk about a good brand, right? If you're doing art, you are already on top. Yeah. So
yes, yes. And yesterday we were ending discussing of the ability of the artist to empower the other. So only few are able to do this. So the problem is also the competence of the artistic leader and this is not easy. And a colleague of us who is doing project here in Torino was exactly asking to the artist, and she, of course, she was saying that he was very successful in involving and empowering the other, but she's a very strong personality with a strong ability to communicate. And so I think just to close on this, that you are absolutely right. The competence of the artist, the art should be, you should be able to empower the other. And I would say also for a long time, not for a short time, not just in the event in which there is the activity. So if the students don't have a question, no, they are very interested, but without any question. Berndt, thank you very. If the others don't have any intervention to make, yes, Berndt, thank you very much for this passionate presentation and your very interesting work. And we will meet also in the future for the Peggy Levitt conference. Thank you very much to everybody. Thank you for
thank you
all.
for having me.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.